The Honorable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hopefully I find my voice. Yeah, it's a strange time. It's rather dry for this time of the year. Mr. Speaker, I rise to make my contribution to this very important debate in this Honorable House, an exercise that many Vincentians take an interest in. You would know from the number of people in the gallery this morning and there yesterday.
I bow to the veteran. He's absolutely right.
Yeah. So we are here debating the budget, Mr. Speaker. A very important exercise because this is basically the framework for setting what the government intends to accomplish throughout the year, what the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines can expect, and hope in many instances will be accomplished. This is twinned, of course, with the debate on the estimates, which we had not so long ago, because that document basically sets out the financial requirements for the various policies and programs of the government and the revenue or the amount of money that would be allocated to try and accomplish them. And of course, the budget exercise today, as always, also deals with the revenue measures that the government intends to bring about. The minister said yesterday that, as Minister of Finance, and he had no taxes in this budget, but there were a number of fees that are going on and will still be costing those persons who have to use them and also the government. But in any event, I wasn't surprised, Mr. Speaker. If it's one thing I could have written in advance of the budget debate, is to say that this being an election year, it's very unlikely that the Minister of Finance was going to raise taxes this year. And so, when he said it, I was not surprised. Yes, there were taxes last year. So, Mr. Speaker, so here we go again. Yesterday, the Minister of Finance stood before this hallowed chamber in this Honorable House, before the people gathered here, and since it's broadcast live, before all the people of our blessed nation who chose to watch. And with a straight face, Mr. Speaker, he made promise after promise that he knows full well he will not keep. The biggest, of course, is the promise to spend $11 million in capital projects. Even he thought that that was reaching a bit far. Not because only of the implementation issues, having enough aggregate is one of the things we talked about, or skilled personnel, but also because they don't have the money. As I said in my debate on the estimates a week and a half ago, there is a gap of $205 million of capital receipts called other receipts, which the minister doesn't know where that is coming from. So many promises, Mr. Speaker, that it seemed to me, listening to him, and I know I wasn't unique, I wasn't alone in this, because I remember one of my colleagues said a similar thing to me afterwards. So many promises that it seems to me that the minister aims to reinvent St. Vincent and the Grenadines this year, in a single year. In other words, what he and his predecessor failed to do in nearly 20 years in government, 20 years in power. Some will say 20 long wasted years. And I might agree with that. He is telling us now, Mr. Speaker, and he wants us to believe that he will accomplish this year. Why it not so serious? And Madam Mr. Speaker, it would be funny, because I found myself, quite frankly, not being able to resist it. I was chuckling, quietly of course, to maintain the decorum of the House. He said that in the 2019 last year's budget, right, I don't think he called names, but it was I who said it, so he was obviously throwing the comment back at me, where I said that the 2019 budget presentation was essentially old wine in new bottles. But this one, Mr. Speaker, is just old wine. It's old bottles this time, because there's a lot of repetition from what was in the last year's budget, and I didn't really realize to what extent until I had a look at both of them last night. As you might imagine, I didn't sleep. So, Mr. Speaker, this is what we have presented here before us. And I will go through it, not in the order it's set out, Mr. Speaker, but I will try to bring some order to the presentation, to let those who are listening, and certainly the minister, it would be fair to him, know where I'm going and what is the point I intend to make. Overall, we see that this budget is the biggest ever in St. Vincent. We went over that in the estimates debate. I refer to it as a big fat lie simply because we know, Mr. Speaker, that it's a problem we've had over the years, that they simply pad it and then balance it with the other receipts category of financing. The minister boasts of his $1 million budget, or his $1 billion budget, the $1 billion man, $1.2 billion almost, which is over nearly $120 million bigger than last year's. So this is, as I said in the previous debate, is clearly an election budget. But the minister doesn't care much or at all where the money is coming from. This is clear because the figures in the estimate show, as I said, that he doesn't know where he's going to get $205.3 million. He simply does not know where this chunk of his proposed expenditure for all the programs and all the wonderful things that he's promising to do to reinvent St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2020. He doesn't know where that large chunk of money is coming from. It's a lot of money for a poor country. 17% of the overall budget. He doesn't know where it's coming from. That's about 40.5%, Mr. Speaker, of the proposed total of the capital receipts of $506.3 million. That's a big hole. So it's bigger than most of the potholes, and some of them I'll show you a little later on. Most of the potholes that the Minister of Transport has to fix from time to time. You can't dispute, Mr. Speaker, that he doesn't know where this money is coming from. It's simply an indisputable fact. And I wish you would spend time explaining why this is in the budget, why it's presented year after year. I say this because, Mr. Speaker, when he's preparing the budget or the estimates, if he knew where that money was coming from, he would have to specify it. He would be obliged to say, well, I'm getting the money from here and from there, and put it there. Otherwise, it would be more dishonest than the practice that is being carried out here, by putting it in as though it's realizable. So we have that as an overall context in which to judge the credibility of the minister when he presented his budget and when he will come back to wrap up, and the other members on the other side. I'm sure when they all get up to speak, they will present their own ministries, hoping that what is allocated to them in the line items of the estimate will actually come. But in a sense, when they get up, they all will be playing musical chairs, because somebody is not going to get what they're promised, or more than one of them, perhaps all of them, because they're not going to be able to have the money to do it. Minister of Transport says he will tell me where the money is coming from. I'd be grateful to hear that, because in the 19 years I've been in this House, Mr. Speaker, 18, all right. Well, since they started running a deficit budget, they've never been able to account for where it's coming from. I see last year they said they got over $150 million in capital receipts. And I asked about it in the estimates debate as to where that came from, and nobody answered. So that's the context, Mr. Speaker, for judging where we are. Now, I want to begin substantively where the minister ended, because towards the end of his presentation, he dealt with the matter of the national debt. That's a public debt of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'll deal with it up front, because it relates to the point I made earlier about the money not being there, because all of this, basically the debt, the lack of source of funding in the estimates, points to a tightening, a constricting situation that is hemming in, even in an election year, the ability of the Minister of Finance to deliver on his promises. So at page 66 and 67 of the budget, the minister, the speech,
Budget
the budget,
speech.
yeah. The budget document, sorry. Not the estimates, the budget speech, yeah. Sorry. When I say the budget, I mean this. The estimates, I would say, the estimates when I mean the bigger document. So page 66, page 67, we see that there's a summary here of the debt. And of course, it's in the back of the estimates. But the point is that the total debt service, that's in the line towards the end of that section on the debt, the total debt service for 2020 is estimated at $267.9 million. That is 39.4% of current revenue. Why is that significant? There's a breakdown here, and we know that when the estimates, we read them in the current revenue that's provided for, the interest is paid. But then the amortization and sinking fund is still left to be paid. And again, I would be really grateful if the minister will enlighten us as to how those funds are obtained to pay the $197 million in amortization and sinking funds contributions. Because we know there's a current surplus that is generated of about $2 million. That obviously can't pay for the debt, but it has to be paid. About more than 2/3 of that debt, I believe, if my memory serves me, is external. And we don't want this country to have a worse reputation by not honoring its commitments to pay its debt. So it would be good to hear how that is done from the minister. Mr. Speaker, as I said, historically, the other receipts that they talk about, only about 5% or less than that is actually realized. So we know that with the debt plus the lack of money, that the government will find itself in a very difficult position. Two things are clear that have been clear to me. About how this government functions. Over the last, as the minister correct me, 18 years that I've been in this house. The things that they do well. One is that they know how to raise taxes to put the people under pressure, because when government want money, they have the law on the side, they can raise taxes and you have to pay. As I said, they did it 3 years in a row following the 2015 election with respect to the VAT. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, is they know how to borrow money. They love to borrow money. So long as they have money to spend, paying it back becomes really an afterthought, it seems to me. They will tell you, or they tell the people when they're going to explain it, this is for the people's benefit. You know, we're doing it. Usually they like to call the name of poor people. They're doing it to help poor people. They're trying to generate income, or at least to put everybody in this country on a better footing. But in reality, borrowing and taxing to help poor people, as the government likes to say, it only makes the country more indebted and consequently poorer. Any 10-year-old school child knows that it doesn't make sense to essentially always be borrowing to meet your needs. At some point, somebody's going to say, pay me back. Unless, of course, you are a big, powerful country, richest country in the world like the United States. That's what I'm saying, but it's a whole different ballgame. So, Mr. Speaker, that 10-year-old child knows that if you make the country poorer by essentially borrowing and spending more than you can manage, or you don't know where it's coming from, eventually all the people in the country will feel it. Perhaps, maybe accepting those people who they might be politically connected and privileged, so they're insulated from some of those pains that the rest of us feel. But it will affect even those that the government claim to love so much. But our people are not, they're not fools, Mr. Speaker. They've been following this for quite some time. And we have been at pains to explain how some of these things affect them. Because they are not just accounting or political points that you're trying to score. These are things that affect people in their real, everyday lives. And I'll give some examples. Number three. I said two. Mr. Speaker, so the national debt at the end of December 31st, 2019, stood at $1.67 billion. It's a bit lower than it was in 2016 when it was 1.7 billion. But I think the drop came about, and the minister correct me, perhaps from the partial forgiveness of part of the Betro-Carib loan, which happened around that time, of over $80 million. So the fact is, Mr. Speaker, in the time that they've been in office, that they've been in power, this ULP government has added over $1.1 billion to the national debt. In a corresponding period, the NDP added just over $500 million, if memory serves me correct. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, they were generating growth approaching 5% on average per annum. So even as this government has been borrowing and spending and borrowing and spending, it hasn't generated the kind of growth that you would expect. Certainly it hasn't matched the performance under the NDP. So you're getting it both ways. Double whammy, as the member said. So the public debt, Mr. Speaker, in 2016 was a little higher, it came down, but the trend is upwards again. So in 2017, the estimate suggests that the figure was 1.63 billion. In 2018, it was 1.65 billion, and of course, in 2019, 1.67. This is worrying, Mr. Speaker. And why? I know there are those who would say we are naysayers and you worry too much and so on. They've said it, I've heard it here. And that the government's intentions are good. You know? And so long as the intentions are good, It should be excused. But we know, Mr. Speaker, that the road to hell, as they say, is often paved with good intentions. And so, where you think that you're achieving something positive, you may actually be doing more harm than you anticipated. Mr. Speaker, they had even misled members of the public and this honorable House by at times conflating our concerns about debt, as expressed very persistently and eloquently by the Honorable Anime Eustace when he was the leader of the opposition, and elsewhere outside of this honorable House. They even conflated that, Mr. Speaker, with a desire on the part of this government for austerity. So, if you're saying you have to be fiscally responsible, that automatically means austerity. But of course, that's not the case. The NDP government, over the 17 and a half years they were in office, they weren't a government that was practicing austerity, but they were able to generate economic growth in the economy overall, while at the same time not ballooning the public debt. And in part because they relied a lot more on the private sector to get things done. You know? They didn't come with this notion that the state is all paramount and everything that has to be done in the country, the government must do it. And everybody else is second fiddle. Well, who pays the government? Is the rest of us? Is everybody else who pays the government? So, it's refreshing, but it's kind of late in the day to see in the budget there's actually a section here, and I'll talk a bit more about it later, about private sector entrepreneurship and foreign direct investment. That's at page 40 of the budget. So all of a sudden, this is the government that's embracing the private sector. But I'll say so. But you're confirming what I said, old wine and old bottles. So, Mr. Speaker, it's still late in the day, 18 years into it. When they came into office, the first thing you hear is how they're going to put Seeker Graves and the Bonadies and whoever supermarkets out of business, because the perception was that they supported NDP, so they were going to bill over the marketing board. Yes. It is worrying, Mr. Speaker, because, not because of you, I would suggest it's in spite of you. Mr. Speaker, why is this worrying? And this is what our people need to understand. That this, as I say, it's not just accounting measures or cheap politics. It's fundamental to how we must function. You do it in your household in terms of balancing your budget. You don't go to the grocery store and buy more than you can do, or buy a faster, bigger car than you can afford. Not if you're responsible. Some people do it. So as the public debt goes up, Mr. Speaker, here's some of the implication. There's a tendency for it to become harder and more expensive for government to borrow, especially if previous borrowings did not result in significant economic growth and the debt to GDP ratio remains above the recommended 60% target. We know that the previous borrowings of this government have not resulted in significant economic growth. Between 2014 and 2018, for example, the economy of St. Vincent and the Grenadines grew by an average of 1.5%. Grenada was over 5% during that period. And in 2019, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank said that it grew by 0.3%. Now, the minister said yesterday that that was all an error, that it's because the statistics department didn't provide the proper information, and so the central bank relied on improper data to make its projections. I mean, that makes incomplete information. The central bank look like it doesn't know its job. It's like school children. But it also, Mr. Speaker, I can't believe the minister would actually admit that in this honorable house, that he as a Minister of Finance allowed that sort of information to go forward to the central bank. So it's either the minister is misleading us, which I don't want to accuse him of,
Honesty and transparency.
or he's just not good at his job. Either way, it's an indictment on the minister. Some things you just have to say, listen, the buck stops with me. And this is what was reported. I mean, these people have been doing this, I would think, all the time. They know what they're supposed to report. In any event, I take the central bank because that's what, it's supposed to rely upon as having relevant and accurate information. The debt to GDP ratio in St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains above what we say is the recommended level of 60%, with the implication, as I said, for harder borrowing. So now it's at 74%. This suggests that the tougher, more expensive borrowing are looming or may already be upon us. The second serious implication, Mr. Speaker, is that it may become increasingly difficult to service the debt because you have to pay back more in interest and amortization. I started out my presentation by pointing out that from the ministers, I'd work it out myself, but from the minister's own presentation at page 66, that the overall debt service is $267.9 million, 39.4% of current revenue. What is concerning, Mr. Speaker, is that the central government's debt service as a percentage of current revenue has grown very fast in the last 4 years. I thought it was somewhere around 24-25%. In 2016, it was 25.1%. In 2017, it was 28.1%. In 2018, it had jumped to 30.2%. And 2019, 34.2%, and now 39% in 2020 projection. So between 2016 and 2020, it moved from 25.1% to 39.4%.
This is debt servicing, you say? Percentage?
Yes. As a percentage of current revenue, yes. And, Mr. Speaker, if we look, I think I have a figure actually of it going back a little further. Can't put my hand on it right now. But the point is that we have had a very rapid growth in the debt service costs in this country over the last 4 years. And that must be worrying for the minister himself. Because when you take that you have to pay the debt, and salaries which account for about another half of the revenue, you basically have a tight squeeze on government's finances. So you have now about almost 40 cents out of every dollar for the government that it collects in current revenue must go to pay the debt. As I said, almost 40%, Mr. Speaker, or 40 cents out of every dollar. And it must be paid. We get a little debt forgiveness from time to time, but the bulk of it has to be repaid. It's a hungry beast, Mr. Speaker. It has to be fed. And who pays it? It's the taxpayer of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the same people who the government says it's trying to help. It means, Mr. Speaker, for most, the average person, that the government may have to cut its transfer of payments to various departments. With high debts, the government can't buy as much medicines for the hospital, so the people will suffer. With high debts, the government cannot properly finance transfers to the ministries and the sectors such as tourism and agriculture and maintenance. I've said over the several years past in this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, my presentations on the tourism industry, I had been at pains to point out how every year there are allocations made to tourism and also to Bragsa, and between 30 and 40% of that is actually transferred. So the effect is real. It could also mean higher taxes, because government has to get money to finance its programs, and reduced government services and investments. And likely it means both. But as we have seen, this is an election year, so the government will hold off on increasing taxes for now. After that, though, heaven forbid, that they're here following the next election, that they form government, that will be the time of reckoning. Because, mark your word, taxes will go up. The only guarantee that that will not happen is an NDP government. As it did, Mr. Speaker, after the 2015 general elections, when they had VAT, they increased it. You know, the member from Central Kingstown got into a little trouble with you, Mr. Speaker, because he said, not again, they're not doing this handout or essentially attempting to bribe the electorate on an industrial scale with all these handouts. And
That is not
they came back.
That is not the reason I was talking about, you know. That is not it at all.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the point is that having done so before the election, they then came back and they took it back. First by putting VAT on salt and margarine, and then they put VAT on 1 percentage point, increase from 15 to 16%, and then they raised or they lowered the threshold where VAT is payable on electricity. So 3 years in a row, the VAT was raised. They had to do that, Mr. Speaker, because they had no other way to raise money. That's the only way they know how to raise tax, borrow money. And moreover, Mr. Speaker, from the practice they have had, because of the paramountcy of the state in everything in this country, they feel that they have a duty to take people's taxpayers' money out of their pocket whenever they feel like it, or whenever they think they can get away with it. Unlike neighboring countries who ease the tax burden and provide enhanced services to the people by raising money through the citizenship by investment programs, this government, with its vain pride, they say, "Me nah sell passport." As if anyone, Mr. Speaker, is suggesting anything so vulgar and crude. What we are suggesting, Mr. Speaker, you won't see anybody down on the street corner basically asking or bidding on the passports. What we do, Mr. Speaker, has been done elsewhere with tremendous success.
Let us allow the Leader of the Opposition to present. I'm particularly concerned when members on his side carries a debate which distracts from what the Leader of the Opposition is saying.
Mr. Speaker, there's a publication here, just to give you an example. You know, all these fellas, they're bread butter not on two sides, on three sides. So they don't have to pay the taxes and to feel the hardship of other people. There are 3 SUVs in the driveway. If they want to go vacation in New York, they could go. But the ordinary people, they have to pay. It says here, Grenada used 40% of CBI revenues to pay off its debt. You see, this is money that you don't borrow to pay debt like we do here. You borrow from NIS to pay debt for the NIS. You borrow IDA money to pay off debt to somebody else. You borrow from CDB to pay off debt to other people. You're digging hole to fill hole. Yes, sir. You're digging hole to fill hole. If somebody has made a substantial, you guys do the same thing. Somebody makes a substantial investment in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, like Mr. Ames. You say he has a stake in this country. He becomes a citizen of the country. No, yes, that was Grenada I was talking about. So, 40% of the revenue. And I'll read a little bit from the thing. The Grenadian economy, this is 2018. The Grenadian economy grew at an estimated 4.5% in 2017, driven by strong activity in construction, tourism, and education sectors, according to the IMF. This is the IMF, you know. Grenada's economy made important strides in recent years, achieving an impressive debt reduction of 37 percentage points of GDP in 2013, improving the framework for fiscal policy, strengthening the financial system, upgrading governance, and creating better business environment. Yeah. Foreign direct investment is estimated at 8.5% of GDP, driven by tourism and the proceeds from citizenship by investment programs, according to the IMF in Article 4 consultation for 2018. So, Mr. Speaker, for those who have it all, they can make all kinds of excuses and make all kinds of false characterizations to seek to justify their stupidity. Mr. Speaker, as I said, the debt to GDP ratio for St. Vincent and the Grenadines is 74%. It's one of the highest. Well, The information I have here from the IMF is 75.4% in 2018. St. Lucia was 64.2%. St. Kitts has one of the largest CBI programs, and they used to have a debt to GDP ratio over 100%. It's now 57.3%. Grenada at 66.2%, I think it's lower in 2019 now. And Dominica at 74%, Antigua 78%. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, you have growth rate in those countries that are exceeding what we have here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So that in 2019, Antigua's growth rate was estimated to be 4.4%, and Dominica 9.02%. Grenada at 3%. St. Kitts 3.4%. St. Lucia 1.4%, but St. Vincent was the last at the bottom with 0.3%. So, Mr. Speaker, we have a situation where the government continues to move us towards this difficult situation. How do they respond to it? You know, there are things that we don't see, on the outside here. The opposition, the way in which they have been managing the finances of the country, we don't get to see it. We can speculate about it, and occasionally somebody may say something that supports what we had feared. But what happens, Mr. Speaker, is that the government, in terms of how it manages the affairs of the country, first of all, you hear a lot of complaints about how, especially contractors, say that they don't get paid on time. Some of them don't get paid at all. But there is something, Mr. Speaker, that we've heard about, but we haven't really discussed it at great length. But I want to address it here today, and the minister can correct me if I'm wrong. And that is, Mr. Speaker, what I would consider to be the lawlessness of this government in the way in which it uses the overdraft facilities which allow it to finance short-term borrowing, to finance certain requirements of government. I've heard persons who may have worked for government before complain about it, saying that the overdraft would spike and so on, and nobody could tell them that they can't use the money. And they tend to go to the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines for this facility. The government, Mr. Speaker, I've said, has abused the use of the overdraft facilities it is allowed to use by law. You will know that, Mr. Speaker, every year at the end of the budget debate and the approval of the budget, the minister moves a motion, right, to allow the government to borrow money by way of fluctuating overdraft to meet its current financial needs. There's usually no debate. It's a kind of expected that this will happen because of the intended benefit of allowing the government to meet its needs when its expected revenues do not come. But that is intended to be short-term. So the motion would normally read, Mr. Speaker, and we have it here, that it allows the government to do it, to borrow in the aggregate from one of the banks, local banks. And I'll read an example I have typed out here for 2019. It says, be it resolved that this Honorable House do authorize the Minister of Finance. It's important that this Honorable House do authorize the Minister of Finance to borrow by means of fluctuating overdraft or otherwise from the First Caribbean Bank or the RBT Bank or the Bank of Nova Scotia or the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, money in the amount not exceeded in the aggregate $50 million during the period 1st of January 2019 to 31st of December 2019 for the purpose of meeting the amount requirements, the current requirements of the government. The borrowing law, Mr. Speaker, that's underneath this is Section 44 and 45 of the Financial Administration Act. And this is what it says. Section 44 says that no money shall be raised on the credit of government. That's the Financial Administration Act, Mr. Speaker, not the Constitution. Its authority is in the Constitution, but I'm quoting the Act here. No money shall be raised on the credit of government except under the authority of this or another Act of Parliament or by a resolution of the House of Parliament. I mean, that is categorical, that is clear. You can't raise money unless Parliament allows it. That is fundamental to democracy, it's fundamental to the way our system of financial accountability governs it, not just here, it's all over the world. Parliament votes the money for the executive to spend. You got to come here and justify it. And then Section 45 of the Finance Administration Act says, the minister may, in a financial year, when authorized by resolution of this House of Assembly, borrow money to meet current requirements from a bank or other financial institution by means of advances to an amount not exceeding in the aggregate, again that's an important point, to an amount not exceeding in the aggregate the sum specified in the resolution. I read the resolution for you just now, it said $50 million. So the Act says, first you must do it by law, either a law that is passed by Parliament or by a resolution. That's the only way you could do it. And it says if it says amount, a specified amount, that is what you have to limit yourself to. You can't exceed it. To exceed it would be, as we say in law, it's ultra vires. But more simply put, it's illegal. You're breaking the law. So let's go over that Section 45 there. The minister may, in a financial year, when authorized by resolution of the House of Assembly, borrow money to meet current requirements from a bank or a financial institution by means of advances to an amount not exceeding in the aggregate the sum specified in the resolution. The Section 45, subsection 2 says this. The resolution, and this is another important point. We tend to get very lax and loose with these things because practice seems to take precedence over what the law says. The resolution referred to in subsection 1 shall have effect for a period not exceeding 12 months. So it's 12 months, 1 year. You borrow that money, you have it for 1 year. That is what it says in the law. And it says, the power of to borrow the money by means of advances from the bank or other financial institutions conferred on the minister by resolution in accordance with this section or in pursuance of an act may be exercised by means of a fluctuating overdraft. A fluctuating overdraft is what they usually do. Simply put, this law allows the government to cover the gap between its expenditure outflows and the revenue inflows These may not always move in sync, Mr. Speaker. So the government is allowed to access that money in order to meet those current requirements. The critical feature of the facility is the limiting of the government's borrowing power to 1 year, as stated above, and as also is reflected in the resolution, because the resolution itself is conformity with the law. It says January 1st to December 31st of the year in which the resolution is passed. In other words, such borrowings is intended to be cleared off by the end of the financial year. But what we see, Mr. Speaker, is over the course of the operation of the government, and I have figures going back to 2009, that at the end of the year, there is usually a huge amount left unpaid on the overdraft. So in 2009, remember the law says, $50 million. At the end of December 2009, the overdraft balance was $85.4 million. They're only allowed to borrow 50, and they have to pay it back. Yet, no, Mr. Speaker, the brazenness is not only that